Hi everyone, this is Joe DeGeorgis. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about depth of field. In our last lecture, we talked about the four variables that control exposure. Exposure is the amount of light that's let into the camera and sensed by the camera detector. Those four variables we said were the ISO, which is the sensitivity of the camera sensor, the aperture, or what we refer to as the f-stop, which is the size of the hole that allows light into the camera. There's the shutter speed, which is a door that opens and closes in front of the aperture, and when it's open it allows light to gain access to the camera and to the sensor ultimately. And then finally we said light itself, and of course we need light in order to take a photograph, because that's what we're photographing, the light and how that light interacts with the subject matter. We said last week that along with controlling exposure, the aperture or the f-stop also controls the depth of field. So the aperture controls both exposure and depth of field. And depth of field is the distance in between objects in the photograph that are considered to be in focus. So just as an example, you might have a little dog, a person, and then a set of mountains in the background. And you could have a very shallow depth of field where the person is in focus, but the dog is out of focus and the mountain is out of focus. Or you could have a wider depth of field in which the dog and the person are in focus, but the mountain is out of focus. Or you could have a very wide depth of field in which all of the subject matter in the scene is in focus. So you can either have shallow or very deep depth of field. The way that the aperture affects depth of field is that the smaller the aperture, the greater the depth of field. So a very wide depth of field for a small aperture, and a very large aperture has a very shallow depth of field. So now if we go back to Sunny 16, we have our ISO set at 100. We have our f-stop, or our aperture, set at f16, of course. We have our shutter speed at the reciprocal of the ISO, which is 1/100. And if we have a sunny day, no clouds in the sky, between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., we said that the photograph will be properly exposed. But what if we want to have a wider depth of field? Well, we have to then change the aperture to a smaller aperture setting, like f22 for instance, which is a larger number but a smaller opening, a smaller aperture. And in fact, f22 lets in 1/2 the amount of light as f16 does. So we've decreased the amount of light. So one thing we could do is we could increase the ISO to 200, and that would make the sensor twice as sensitive, so it would require half as much light. So if you had an ISO of 200, an f-stop of f22, a shutter speed of 1/100, and a sunny sky between 10 and 2, we will still be properly exposed, but we will have a greater depth of field at f22. So more of the scene will be in focus. If we wanted to go the other way, that is, have a very short depth of field, then we have to open up the aperture f11, which would be twice as much light, or f8, which would be twice as much as f11, but 4 times as much as f16, and to f5.6, which would be twice as much light as f8, but 8 times as much light as f16. So we've opened up 3 stops, and there's 8 times the amount of light coming in to the camera at this point. Our ISO was set at 100 for Sunny 16, and the problem is we can't make this sensor less sensitive. 100 is the least sensitive. So what that means is we're going to have a faster shutter speed because we need to cut down on the amount of light. So if we go from 100 to 200, that's half as much light. 1 over 100 to 1 over 400 would be half as much light, and 1 over 400 to 1 over 800 would be half as much light. Or from 100 to 400 is 1/4 the amount of light. 100 to 800 is 1/8 the amount of light. So if it's a sunny day between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. and you set your ISO at 100 and your shutter speed at 1 over 100, but then want to change your f-stop from f16 to f5.6 so that you have a very shallow depth of field, then you need to change the shutter speed in this case. If we're letting in 8 times the amount of light by opening up the aperture, we have to increase the shutter speed to allow only 1/8 the amount of light in, so that this 1/8 the amount of light balances this 8 times the amount of light, and we'll end up still with the correct exposure.